When my children started discussing among themselves who would be the first to go get the money, I already knew what would come next. They didn't realize I could hear through the walls, that I could feel the lies in the pauses between their words. I handed over the safe deposit box key myself, without resistance. They thought they had won. But while they were cheerfully driving to the bank with the plastic envelope in hand, I was pouring myself tea and looking out the window. Now, it was my right to decide who I owed, and who I never would again. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Martin Halloway. I was 81 years old when the mornings started getting longer and the nights began to shrink into brief interruptions of light sleep. I had lived alone for the past 14 years, ever since my wife passed away in the hospital room with the sound of rain tapping the window behind her. We had no music playing, just the rhythm of the IV pump, the hum of sterile lights, and my hand holding hers long after she let go. I lived in a small house in southern Pennsylvania, not far from where I grew up. It was a modest one-story brick structure with green shutters and a front porch that creaked in the wind. I kept it clean. A man ought to keep his spaces in order, whether anyone visits or not. The grass was trimmed every Thursday. The gutters stayed unclogged. The mailbox stood upright, freshly painted each spring. I woke up every morning at 5:48, not 5:45, not 5:50, always 5:48. It was a habit I picked up during my years in the Navy. I was a systems technician in naval aviation, responsible for troubleshooting guidance systems and communications arrays on aircraft carriers. I wasn't a pilot, but I knew the sky well enough to tell when a storm was lying. I trusted gears and wires more than people. Machines had logic. People didn't. That morning, like all others, began with silence. A silence so thick you could peel it off the air and fold it like an old sheet. I sat on the edge of my bed, feet flat on the floor, toes curling against the cold linoleum tiles I had never bothered to replace with something more fashionable. I reached down, slid on my socks, first the left, then the right, and stood up slowly, bones clicking like worn-out typewriter keys. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon oil and dry heating ducts. I kept my thermostat at 62 degrees year-round. That's the right temperature to stay alert without being uncomfortable. I passed the framed photos lining the hallway wall. Old family shots, weddings, birthdays, holidays. But I didn't look at them. I knew them all by heart. I could close my eyes and tell you the pattern of every necktie, every smile that didn't reach the eyes, every shoulder that leaned just slightly away from mine. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle with exactly 1.5 cups of water, not more. I hated waste. I turned the burner on low and set the kettle down with a precision that would have passed inspection on a carrier deck. While it heated, I pulled out the tin of Assam tea from the second cabinet on the right, behind the salt, next to the aspirin I rarely used. I opened the lid and inhaled. Earthy, bitter, dependable. As the water came to a slow boil, I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The world was still gray with the kind of pre-dawn fog that clings to your ankles like memory. The neighborhood was quiet. Lawns were damp, trash bins untouched. Across the street, Mr. Kellerman's pickup was parked at a slight angle again. I made a mental note. The man never did fix that alignment. Some folks leave things crooked for years and call it character. I stood outside for a few minutes longer, feeling the wooden railing beneath my fingers, the slight groan of the boards underfoot. I liked the sensation of being awake while the world slept. It gave me space to think, not about the big things, not mortality or forgiveness or God, but about small, measurable things, the amount of fuel left in the generator, whether the rain last week had loosened the gutter bracket, how much rice I had in the pantry. Back inside, the kettle began to rattle. I poured the water over the tea leaves, covered the mug with a small ceramic lid, and set the timer. 3 minutes. No more. Weak tea is for people who pretend to think. I brought the cup into the living room and placed it on the coaster beside my chair, the one with the flattened cushion and the worn arms. The sun hadn't yet breached the horizon, but a faint light was beginning to stretch across the ceiling, making the dust motes dance. I opened the newspaper, but I didn't read. My eyes moved across the print, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought about my son, John, about my daughter, Sarah, about how lately their visits had become more frequent, more polished, more rehearsed. There was a pattern to their kindness. It was too timed, too precise, like the click of a fake gear in a broken watch. I knew the signs. In my line of work, the smallest misalignment could bring down an entire system. One loose wire, one mistimed signal, one overconfident technician. I had seen it happen more than once. People trying to rush through calibration, thinking they knew better. They never did. Outside, a bird landed on the railing. A chickadee. Light, nervous, fluttery. It stayed for a second, then flew off without a sound. I watched its wings vanish into the mist. Then I took a slow sip of tea. Strong, hot, clean. The clock on the mantel ticked over to 6:15. I folded the newspaper without creasing it. I stood up, walked to the hallway, and opened the closet. Inside, on the top shelf, sat a small black lockbox. Not the bank deposit box, just an old metal container where I kept spare keys and papers. I pulled it down, opened it, and looked at the single silver key resting on a faded cloth. It was clean, untouched, innocent. I closed the box and put it back. There was no urgency, no fear, just routine. I had been through harder mornings. I had packed the remains of friends into metal containers marked for military transport. I had written letters to widows. I had rewired broken systems with only minutes to spare. I knew how to handle pressure, and I knew what was coming. The morning was still young. It started gradually, like the slow drip of a faucet in a quiet room. I didn't notice it right away. Or maybe I did, but chose not to name it. The first visit came on a Thursday. John showed up with a box of pastries and a strained smile. He said he had just been in the area, thought he'd stop by. I let him in. He sat at the kitchen table, looked around like a man searching for something to compliment, then settled on the floors. He said they looked clean. I told him I mop every Tuesday. That was the extent of it. The next week, it was Sarah. She brought a casserole dish wrapped in a towel, warm and heavy. She said it was chicken and wild rice. I thanked her. She asked about the thermostat, mentioned that it felt cold inside. I told her 62 degrees was just right. She pressed her lips together in that polite way that pretends to agree. Her eyes wandered. She asked if I needed help organizing my papers. I told her everything was in order. She nodded, but I could see the disapproval sitting just behind her smile, like a shadow waiting for its cue. Their visits multiplied, sometimes together, sometimes alone. They called ahead now, their voices bright and sweet as syrup. They asked about my health, my appetite, my routines. They asked what I was doing with my time. They said it was important to stay engaged, to keep the mind active. I told them I liked silence. They laughed as if that was charming. They brought books I didn't ask for, suggested TV shows I'd never watch, asked about my old friends, the ones who were mostly dead or drifting in memory. They brought gifts, a new throw blanket, a coffee grinder, vitamin supplements. John installed a new smoke detector without asking. Sarah reorganized my medicine cabinet, moving everything into color-coded bins. They praised the house, but always with qualifiers. Still holding up after all these years. Amazing what good maintenance can do. So many memories in a place like this. They never said what they were circling, but I could hear the wheels turning. I knew warmth when it was real, the kind that comes unannounced, with unpolished conversation and uneven silences, the kind that isn't looking past your shoulder. What they offered was something else, a warmth manufactured to look like care, designed with precision, tailored to generate a response. It was warmth as a function of strategy, not affection. I had seen it before in people who wanted clearance to places they didn't belong. They asked about the bank, not directly. They asked how I managed my bills, if I needed help with taxes, if I ever thought about consolidating assets. They dropped words like efficiency and safety. They didn't look at me when they said these things. They looked at the table, at the floor, at their phones when they thought I wasn't watching. I played along. I answered in vague tones. I said I had it handled. I said I appreciated their concern. I smiled at the right moments. I let them believe they were making progress. I let them believe their warmth was working. But I was taking notes. I noticed the way Sarah looked at the small locked drawer in my desk, the one that hadn't been opened in years. I saw John glance toward the bookshelf where I kept the safe deposit box documents in a manila folder behind the old naval manuals. They never asked about the key. Not yet. But their attention lingered in the same places, like a compass spinning near a magnet. They started bringing the grandchildren. I hadn't seen them in months. Suddenly they were everywhere, running through the living room, bouncing on the couch, asking me if I remembered their names. I did. I always had. I just chose silence over small talk. The children were loud, clumsy, alive in a way that reminded me what I had once been. But even they felt like a tool now, like a charm worn for persuasion. "Look," they seemed to say, "we brought joy with us. Aren't you moved?" I nodded and offered cookies. I asked them about school, let them draw on the back of envelopes. I let Sarah take photos of us sitting together. She said she wanted memories. I knew she wanted evidence. When they left, I washed the dishes slowly, methodically. I ran hot water over the sink until steam filled the kitchen. I stood there with my hands under the stream, the heat turning my skin red. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was measuring, calibrating. I remembered an old aircraft I once worked on. There was a glitch in the communication system, a misfire that only occurred under specific conditions. The pilot couldn't replicate it, but I found it. I knew how to listen to silence until it made a sound. I knew how to wait until the machine revealed its flaw. That's what I was doing now. They came again the next week. John brought a folder of papers and a pen he claimed he had borrowed from his office. Sarah brought a quiche, homemade, still warm. They said they wanted to talk. Just a few small matters, they said. Clarifications, planning, nothing urgent. I offered them tea. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where my wife once painted Christmas ornaments, the same one where I read the letter about my discharge, the same one where I decided, long ago, that silence was more powerful than protest. They started with compliments about my health, my clarity, my memory. Then the questions came, gentle, practiced, like drops of water over stone. They asked about next steps, about my comfort, about my intentions. I looked at the window behind them. The reflection in the glass showed two people I barely recognized. Their bodies looked familiar. Their voices used words I knew. But the rhythm was off. The music was wrong. It wasn't warmth. It was calculation wearing a knitted sweater and a patient smile. I told them I needed rest. They left with half-finished tea and forced cheer in their eyes. I sat in my chair after they were gone. The room smelled of cinnamon and deception. I could feel it in the cushions. I could hear it in the ticking of the clock on the wall. Every visit from now on would be a move in their strategy. That was fine. I had strategies too. It didn't come all at once. The change, I mean. It crept in like humidity through old windows. Slow, invisible, but heavy. I couldn't point to the exact moment when their requests turned into something else. There was no single word, no raised voice, no door slammed shut. Just a shift in tone, a quiet drop in temperature. The warmth they had manufactured began to cool. It became impatient, less polished, less kind. They started repeating themselves. That was the first sign. Repeating the same points as if I hadn't heard them the first dozen times. They used phrases like, "We're just thinking ahead," and "It's time to be practical." Sarah printed articles about elder fraud and misplaced inheritances, placing them casually beside the mail pile. John brought spreadsheets with color-coded tabs, as if numbers could somehow soothe betrayal. They framed everything as protection. Protection from scams. Protection from mistakes. Protection from myself. I watched their eyes more than their mouths. Their eyes betrayed them. Eyes that couldn't hold still. Eyes that darted to the desk drawer, to the file cabinet, to the safe that I hadn't opened in years. They were hunting. Smiling while they hunted, but hunting all the same. One afternoon, John called. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't talk about the weather or the grandkids. He launched straight into logistics. He said they had spoken with an advisor. He said consolidating assets was safer at my age. He said I should consider transferring the contents of the safe deposit box into a trust for streamlining. I listened without speaking. When he finished, he waited, probably expecting a protest, a plea for understanding. I gave him neither. I told him I'd think about it. He hung up, sounding satisfied. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my hands for a long time. They were still steady, still capable. These were the same hands that had once rewired a failing navigation system mid-flight, the same hands that had sealed emergency valves during a power failure, the same hands that had caught my wife's as she collapsed in the garden one summer evening. These were not the hands of a man who needed protection. The following weekend, Sarah arrived with a leather folder and her husband in tow. They acted like it was casual. They stayed for coffee, made jokes about the creaky front door, complimented the garden. But their movements were rehearsed. Her husband waited by the coat rack, gripping the folder like it was a tool or a weapon. When the coffee had cooled and the silence grew too large to ignore, Sarah pulled out the documents. She used the word necessary. She used the word peace of mind. She used the word trust. She did not use the word choice. The papers were drafted. Signatures needed. My name was printed in neat, formal font across each page. My address. My date of birth. My history reduced to lines of ink and blank boxes. I picked up the papers. Not to read them, just to feel the weight. Legal paper is always heavier than regular paper. That's deliberate. It wants to make you feel it, wants you to believe it matters more. But I had signed heavier things in my life. Deployment orders, death confirmations, letters to families of men who never came home. This wasn't weight. This was pressure dressed as formality. I told them I needed time. They didn't argue, not directly. But the air between us was thick with unspoken things. Sarah tried to smile, but it cracked. Her husband's foot tapped quietly on the floor, like a ticking clock no one could shut off. After they left, I placed the papers in a drawer. I didn't shred them. I didn't burn them. I wanted to keep them, as evidence, as memory, as warning. That week, the phone calls became shorter, less patient. They asked for updates. They phrased it as concern. They pushed harder. John mentioned a lawyer. Sarah mentioned worsening memory and difficult decisions. They were building a case, quietly, strategically. I began receiving envelopes from offices I didn't recognize. They bore logos of estate firms and elder law groups. Inside were pamphlets, fee structures, testimonials from smiling seniors who had taken control of their futures. I didn't throw them away. I read every one, not because I was interested, but but because I wanted to see the shape of the campaign they were building. They had crossed a line, not loudly, not with malice, but with calculation. They believed their plan was clean, legal, inevitable. They underestimated me. I had followed orders my entire life, from commanding officers, from engineers, from protocol sheets written in ink and sweat. But I had also learned when to disobey, when the system was wrong, when the orders ignored the human cost, when following the rule meant failing the mission. And this manipulation wrapped in politeness, this was the kind of order you follow only if you want to become hollow. I took the key from its hiding place. I held it in my palm. It was small, lighter than I remembered, just a slip of metal, but it carried weight, history, power, and now, target. I sat in the living room with the key resting on the arm of the chair. I stared at it as the light shifted through the blinds. I thought about everything it had come to represent in their eyes: wealth, control, victory. In mine, it meant something else: a test, a message, a line in the sand. I knew what came next. The pressure would increase. The suggestions would turn to demands. The affection would curdle into frustration. And when that failed, they would reach for more drastic tools: legal tools, medical tools, stories about my mind, my memory, my decline. But I wasn't declining. I was planning. I didn't need a strategy team. I didn't need a lawyer or a therapist or a committee. I needed only time, silence, and the precision I had cultivated over a lifetime of solving problems others couldn't see. I placed the key back where it belonged, and I waited. I had spent a lifetime reading systems that didn't speak: radar arrays, guidance panels, electrical grids. None of them used words, but all of them told the truth. They whispered through blinking lights and shifted voltages, through hesitations in data and hitches in alignment. If you listened closely enough, if you trained your senses not just to look, but to observe, not just to hear, but to register, you could decode the whole world in silence. That was what I did now. Silence had become the instrument panel of my life. My house, my body, my children. Each a system I monitored without speaking. The way John's emails grew shorter, more pointed. The way Sarah's texts arrived exactly 3 minutes after every doctor's appointment I scheduled. The way they both stopped asking how I was sleeping and started asking if I ever felt confused or lost. Not once. Always ever. Like a fishing expedition masked as concern. I recorded every detail. Not on paper. Not with technology. Just in my mind. The way I used to log instrument readings during diagnostic drills. I marked the frequency of visits, the length of pauses between sentences, the shift in eye contact. Their concern had a pattern, and that pattern was tightening like a noose designed to look like an embrace. In the military, we were taught to navigate without sound. During night ops, silence was survival. We read terrain through boots on the ground, through the changing density of shadows. We felt the direction of wind by how it carried the scent of oil or gunpowder. Our ears were always open, but it was the absences that spoke loudest. That's how I lived now, one step at a time, through darkness and shifting terrain, without drawing attention. They believed I was drifting, that my quiet was an indicator of decay. What they didn't know, or couldn't imagine, was that I had never been more focused. Each morning, I went through the same motions, but with heightened precision. I timed the kettle boil to the second. I aligned the edge of the newspaper with the table's grain. I resharpened pencils that didn't need sharpening. These weren't habits. They were calibrations. I was tightening the machinery of myself, preparing for something they hadn't forecasted. I walked the perimeter of the house every afternoon, checking locks, hinges, basement seals. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't paranoid. I was reading the terrain. The cracks in the foundation told me where water might try to slip in. The lean of the mailbox told me which way the ground was settling. The tremor in my left hand each evening told me when to adjust my blood pressure pills. These were all signals. I wasn't ignoring them. I was listening more intently than ever. I spent an entire day reviewing the documents I had stored in the attic. Not the financial ones. Those were irrelevant now. I reviewed letters, notes from my wife, instructions I had written to myself over the years. I reread the folder that held her final wishes, her annotations in the margins, the way she underlined dignity 3 times on the page about long-term care. She had trusted me to understand the difference between survival and autonomy. I sat in the attic under the slanted roof with dust collecting on my sleeves and realized something I hadn't admitted out loud. My children had no idea who I was. They knew my routines, my favorite chair, my preferred tea, but they didn't know the man behind the calm. They didn't know I had once traced a comms failure in a disabled jet using nothing but a flashlight and my sense of smell. They didn't know I could read tension in a wire the way most men read faces. They underestimated silence. They mistook it for surrender. They believed stillness meant passivity, as if they were the only ones moving on the board. But I had never stopped moving. I had simply chosen a different rhythm, one they couldn't hear. I started taking long drives on Tuesday mornings. Nothing dramatic, just 30, maybe 40 miles into the surrounding towns. I stopped at diners, bought gas, paid in cash, watched people, listened to voices, collected atmospheres. There was something cleansing about being unknown in a place, something powerful. I didn't wear my veteran cap. I didn't bring my cane. I walked like a man whose joints still had reason to bend. On one of those drives, I stopped at a community center I had passed a dozen times before. It had a brick facade and a veteran's flag out front. Inside, I met a young woman who asked if I wanted to volunteer or just visit. I told her I was just looking around. She gave me a brochure and asked nothing more. That was the kind of warmth I remembered, the kind that didn't want anything in return. I read the brochure later that night. They were building a new wing, a residential support facility for older vets. It wasn't a hospice. It wasn't a nursing home. It was something in between. A place with quiet rooms, shared gardens, and an old workshop behind the main house that they hadn't figured out how to fund yet. I folded the brochure into thirds and placed it under my placemat. Not because I was planning to move in, but because I had started thinking about where the last version of myself should rest. Not in the hands of those who saw me as a bank vault with a pulse. Not under a roof where every word would be measured, recorded, leveraged. I thought about my bank box. I thought about the key that sat in its designated drawer, untouched but always visible. I thought about how much faith they had placed in it. That one piece of metal. To them, it represented legacy, inheritance, the endgame of a long campaign they had already convinced themselves they'd won. To me, it was just a signal, a beacon, a false target. I hadn't decided yet what I would do, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not let noise guide me. I would navigate the way I always had, through silence, through instinct, through the slow turning of unseen gears. And when the moment came, I would move quietly. So quietly, they wouldn't even know I had moved at all. There were certain procedures I had memorized decades ago that never left me. Emergency routines, fail-safe sequences, the kind of logic you fall back on when everything else begins to slide. In the Navy, when a system failed mid-air or mid-mission, we didn't panic. We reverted to protocol, not because we believed it would always save us, but because having a structure, a framework, gave us clarity when clarity was in short supply. That's what this was now. A failure in the system, not a mechanical one, but something deeper, more personal. The structure of family, trust, respect, understanding, had degraded slowly over the years, And now the readings were clear. The signals were erratic, the integrity compromised. The moment called for old instincts, not reaction, response. So I ran the checklist. I reviewed every document I had ever signed, every account still active, every paper trail with my name on it. I pulled out the battered brown accordion folder where I kept tax returns going back 20 years. I sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and yellow legal pad and traced the veins of my financial body. Not for fear, but for discipline. I wanted to know what they thought they knew, and I wanted to know how wrong they were. The safe deposit box was never the vault they believed it to be. It hadn't been in years. I had emptied most of it out incrementally over time. Quiet withdrawals, a certificate here, a bearer bond there. The contents now were mostly ceremonial. A few old medals, a notarized letter, and an empty envelope that once held something worth arguing about. That was by design. Decoys were standard practice when you suspected surveillance. And make no mistake, I was being watched. They hadn't installed cameras. They didn't need to. Their surveillance came in the form of questions masked as concern. Do you remember what day it is? Did you say you paid the electric bill this month? Have you thought about a power of attorney just in case? These weren't casual. They were pressure tests, probing, measuring the edges of control. So I escalated my protocol. I drove to the bank on a weekday morning, long before they would think to check in. I wore my oldest jacket. I carried nothing but my wallet and the key. At the counter, I presented my ID and made the request. The clerk, a young man with careful posture and a thin mustache, led me to the private room without comment. He unlocked the box and left me alone. I opened it slowly, as if diffusing something delicate. Inside, just as I expected, were the final pieces, the last remnants of their imagined treasure. I removed everything, methodical, intentional. I placed the medals back in a small cloth pouch. The letter, unread by anyone but me, I folded twice and slid into the inside pocket of my jacket. The envelope I left behind, deliberately, its flap neatly sealed, its weight deceptively light. I closed the box. When I left the bank, I didn't go straight home. I drove north, past the edge of town, toward the facility I had visited weeks earlier, the one with the unfinished workshop and the quiet flag out front. I had made an appointment. The director greeted me with a nod and no questions. We walked the grounds together. He showed me the blueprints for the expansion. He spoke of funding goals and shortfalls. I listened. Then I handed him the envelope. Not the empty one, the real one. Inside it were instructions, a check, a list of stipulations, not to name the wing after me, not to use my name on any plaque or promotional material. Just build it, staff it, use it well. He accepted it with the quiet professionalism of a man who understood that gratitude should never be louder than the gift. When I returned home that evening, I felt lighter, not in the sentimental way, but in the precise way a plane feels when it drops unnecessary cargo. I moved through the house with deliberate pace. I put the medals in the drawer next to my shaving kit. I placed the folded letter behind a loose panel in the floorboards of my study. It wasn't hiding. It was anchoring, like ballast in a storm. Then I retrieved the dummy envelope from the desk drawer, the one I'd prepared months ago. Inside were blank sheets of paper cut to the size of bank documents. I sealed it carefully and tucked it into a plain white folder. That folder I placed into the filing cabinet where I knew they would look first. I wanted it to be easy. I wanted the illusion to hold just long enough to get them moving. In operational terms, it was a controlled misdirection. That night I boiled water for tea and stood by the window watching the last light fade behind the treetops. The house was quiet. No phone calls, no texts. They hadn't noticed anything yet, but they would, soon. There was a comfort in following the old protocol, in mapping out contingencies and fail-safes. I knew what came next. They'd press harder. They'd grow more direct. They might even come with documents in hand, declarations of intent, expectations spelled out in legal terms. And I would let them. I would watch. I would take notes the way I always had. Silently, carefully, without interruption. The difference was, now I had already moved the payload. The mission was complete. Everything else was just noise. It began with the thermostat. Sarah asked me on a Tuesday afternoon if I ever felt cold in the mornings. I told her 62 degrees was enough. She smiled and nodded like she heard me, then came back the next day with a brand new programmable thermostat tucked under her arm, the kind that lights up and shows you the weather, like it's trying to make conversation. John installed it while I was in the backyard, cleaning the bird bath. He told me afterward that it would make things easier. Easier for whom was never clarified. The temperature rose by 3 degrees without my approval. I lowered it back. The next day, it rose again. Then came the groceries. They started arriving without request. Bags full of low-sodium soups and pre-cut fruit in plastic tubs. Everything bland, soft, and unseasoned. They labeled it digestible. I labeled it surveillance. Each package was carefully selected to suggest fragility. Pudding cups, herbal teas, fiber supplements, the kind of items you stock when you want to reinforce a narrative. They brought me a pill organizer, uninvited. A wide, rainbow-colored box with 4 compartments for each day of the week. Morning, noon, evening, night. Sarah said it was just a tool, not a suggestion. John nodded like it had been his idea. I placed it on the counter and never touched it. I knew what they were doing. Small shifts, incremental framing, preparing the scene for a performance I never agreed to give. Their visits increased, but the timing became strategic. They arrived unannounced more often, letting themselves in with the spare key I had forgotten I gave them years ago. They would call out my name, slow and deliberate, as if I might not answer. Their footsteps softened, as if expecting to find me collapsed in a chair or on the floor. When they found me upright, alert, stirring my tea or folding laundry, they masked their disappointment behind relieved exclamations. I noticed their glances toward the sink, the stove, the floor. They were cataloging signs of decline, like detectives at a crime scene where the victim refused to cooperate. One day, John lingered a little too long at the fuse box. Another time, Sarah asked how many times I had left the fridge door open that week. I told her none. She tilted her head like she didn't believe me. They started using new phrases. Aging in place. Safe autonomy. Preventive steps. These weren't terms of affection. They were bureaucratic armor, words designed to sound empathetic while justifying intrusion. I let them talk. I responded with silence or vague agreement. It made them feel like they were making progress. But I was watching too. I watched how Sarah's hands lingered on the stack of unopened mail, how John always picked up the landline phone and stared at it before setting it down again, how they both flinched slightly when I mentioned the bank, even in passing. Their care was a performance, and I was the unwilling actor. The stage was my home. The script was written in condescension and delivered through cheerful voices. Then came the real pivot, the suggestion of options. Sarah brought pamphlets. Not many, just 3. She placed them on the table between the cups of tea and the sugar bowl, the way you might place a flower arrangement, gently, reverently, hoping no one noticed it had been purchased for effect. Each one showed pictures of smiling seniors in pastel-colored cardigans, playing checkers, doing watercolor, petting golden retrievers. They looked like they'd been kidnapped from a cruise ship and given tranquilizers. She didn't say I should go. Not directly. She said things like, "Just so you know what's out there," or, "A friend of mine moved her father recently, and it's been really wonderful for him." John added that the places had excellent security. He didn't mention from whom. I asked what they cost. They stumbled over numbers. I asked who would be paying. They said, "We'll figure that out." I knew what that meant. They'd already discussed it. My assets were part of the calculation. They thought I was fading. They thought they were staging an intervention. What they didn't realize was that I had staged the room long before they arrived. I had left things out on purpose: an unpaid bill, a slightly expired yogurt, a crossword puzzle left unfinished in the paper, all planted like props. I wanted to see what they would notice. They noticed everything, just as I expected. The more they cared, the more obvious the performance became. They brought over a tablet with a large font, already loaded with memory games. They asked if I wanted to go for walks, just for some fresh air. Sarah started using the phrase "checking in" when she called. John once said, "We just want to make sure you're not overwhelmed." I didn't laugh, but I felt the irony settle deep in my chest. They weren't offering help. They were preparing control. And in doing so, they told me everything I needed to know. The care was conditional. The love was performative. The concern was procedural. Everything about their behavior followed a checklist, the kind written in a lawyer's office or after a consultation with an estate planner. So I gave them what they wanted. One morning, after breakfast, I placed the key to the safe deposit box into a small envelope. No letter, no explanation, just the key. I sealed the envelope and placed it in Sarah's purse while she was in the bathroom. I knew she would find it. I knew she would pretend to be surprised. I knew she would call John within the hour. That night, they didn't call me. They were too busy planning their next move. It didn't matter. I had already made mine, and they would never see it coming. The morning they left for the bank, the house felt heavier than usual, not from emotion, but from the absence of pretense. The show was over. The cups were still in the sink from the night before. The cushions on the couch bore the shape of their bodies, where they'd sat rehearsing gratitude, fidgeting with coats, stealing glances at the drawer where the envelope had been. When they left, I didn't follow them to the window. I didn't watch the car reverse or see Sarah fold the envelope neatly into her lap, like it was a sacred text. I just stood in the hallway, surrounded by silence, and exhaled. There was a finality to the way they left, a kind of satisfied closure in their gait, in the way they didn't look back, didn't linger. They thought it was done. They thought they had won. And that was precisely what I needed them to believe. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon from the stale pastries they had brought. I dumped them into the trash without hesitation. I washed the mugs, dried them, and placed them exactly where they belonged. Every movement had purpose, nothing wasted, nothing sentimental. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel sorrow. What I felt, if anything, was alignment. My life had become a system again, a network of gears and levers moving in precise sequence toward a planned outcome. The key had been handed off. The script they had written was now unfolding without interruption. But the part they didn't know, the part they never considered, was that the ending had been rewritten a long time ago. Their drive would take 42 minutes under normal traffic. I knew the route well. I had taken it myself countless times, including the day I emptied the safe deposit box. I remembered every crack in the road, every traffic light they would sit behind, every left turn that would feel like progress. They'd speak in clipped, excited tones. Sarah would rehearse what she planned to do with the funds. John would calculate. They were always calculating. That was the difference between them and me. I worked with systems. They worked with outcomes. At precisely the moment I estimated they entered the bank, I made tea. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't part of some cinematic flourish. It was just what I always did. The familiarity of boiling water, of leaves steeping in silence, grounded me. This wasn't a celebration. It wasn't revenge. It was balance. The restoration of something that had been lopsided for too long. I sipped the tea at the window, not to watch, but to feel the stillness. I imagined their faces when the vault door opened, the polished anticipation, the heat in their fingers as they reached for folders and envelopes that no longer existed. The confusion, the silence that would stretch too long between them, the unspoken fear. Had they been too late? Had someone gotten there first? Had I fooled them? The answer, of course, was yes. I hadn't hidden anything. I hadn't buried gold in the backyard or wired funds to some offshore account. I had simply made a choice, quietly, deliberately, a reallocation of meaning. The contents of that box had never truly belonged to them, not morally, not emotionally, legally perhaps. But legality was a language that changed its tune depending on who paid the lawyer. What they had expected to find was proof of victory. What they found was absence, and absence can be louder than any declaration. Back at home, I opened the file drawer and removed the decoy documents, the ones I'd planted weeks earlier in case they ever searched. Blank pages, folded into envelopes, deeds that had been voided years ago, account numbers long since closed. I burned them in the sink, watching the paper curl and blacken without emotion. These were no longer needed. The performance was complete. The illusion had served its purpose. In the afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the house one last time, not for security, but for memory. I touched the fence where my wife once leaned to talk to the neighbor. I stepped onto the patch of soil where the lilacs used to bloom before Sarah had them replaced with ornamental shrubs. I stood beneath the eaves, listening to the faint hum of the wind nudging against the siding. The house didn't speak, but it held the weight of years. Every doorframe had been touched by time. Every window knew what had been seen. Inside, I opened the small box beneath the bed. Inside it, folded in tight quarters, were photographs, real ones, printed, not digital. Images they hadn't seen. My wife in her nursing uniform, arms crossed, stern and strong. Me, in my younger years, covered in oil and grit beside an aircraft I once brought back to life, with nothing more than a socket wrench and intuition. A dog we buried before John was even born. A world they had no reference for, no connection to, and no claim on. I didn't cry. I didn't even linger. I placed the photos back and locked the box. By evening, I knew they would return. I knew the calls would come. First Sarah, her voice tight with controlled confusion, asking if perhaps there was another key. Perhaps I had forgotten something. Then John, more direct, asking what I had done. Not what I meant, what I had done. He would demand clarity, but clarity was never owed. Not anymore. I made no preparations for those calls. I didn't script responses. I had no need to lie, no need to explain. My work was done. What happened next was no longer in my hands. It was in theirs, and that was the part they had never prepared for. They had built their strategy around expectation. I had built mine around silence. And now, for the first time, the path forward was theirs alone. But it was a one-way route, and I had chosen not to follow. The phone rang 5 times that day. 3 from Sarah, 2 from John. I let each one go to voicemail. The messages started composed and concerned, but as the hours stretched, the tones shifted. Concern turned to confusion, confusion to irritation, and by the end of the evening, there was a pause in John's voice that I hadn't heard in years. Something like doubt. Not in me, but in himself. And that, I knew, was the precise moment the balance began to tilt. It was subtle, the kind of shift you can't see on a screen or measure in percentages. But I could feel it. The arc of control, the quiet current that had been pulling me for weeks, maybe months, had finally begun to reverse. They didn't have the leverage they thought they had. They didn't have the access. What they had was an empty box, a cold key, and the sudden realization that their version of the story no longer held the pen. That evening, I stood in the center of the living room and took a long look around, not out of nostalgia, but orientation. Like a pilot checking the cockpit before descent. Everything was where it should be. The furniture aligned with the window light, the rug unwrinkled, the books dusted, the air clean. But something deeper had shifted. The architecture of expectation, the unspoken agreement that I would remain still while they maneuvered around me. That agreement was broken now. I sat in my armchair and pulled the ledger from the drawer beside me. A simple notebook, brown cover, spine frayed from decades of use. It wasn't a journal in the traditional sense. There were no musings or poems, no reflections on the meaning of life, just observations, patterns, names, dates, locations, things people said, and things they didn't. It was how I had always made sense of the world, through detail. I flipped back several pages until I reached the section I had labeled transition phase. That was my term for the period between exposure and escalation. In any operation, whether mechanical or interpersonal, there came a moment when the system became aware that it was being interfered with. From there, it either adapted or failed. John and Sarah were now in that phase. They were scrambling to adapt, but without data, they were blind. That was intentional. I had left them with no trail, no receipts, no records of transfers. The assets were not hidden, just redefined, moved out of their reach not through secrecy, but through irrelevance. What they had assumed was inheritance had already been transmuted into something else entirely, something with purpose, something outside the orbit of their entitlement. But this chapter wasn't about the money. That part was already sealed. This was about the shift in silence. That night, I retrieved a box from the back of the closet. It contained only one item of real value, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, the same one I had used during training to analyze engine noise from failing turbines. I had kept it all these years, not because I thought I'd need it, but because certain tools deserved respect. I placed it on the table and connected the leads. It worked. The hum of the motor was faint, steady, reliable. I inserted a blank reel and pressed record. I didn't speak into it. I didn't need to. I let it capture the sound of the house, the creaks of the floorboards, the ticking of the wall clock, the occasional wind brushing against the window pane. These sounds, though mundane, were honest. And for me, they were the measure of control, a system undisturbed. The next morning, I received a letter. Not from Sarah or John, from the director of the Veterans Center. He thanked me, formally, for the anonymous contribution. He explained, in careful language, that the funds had been accepted and allocated according to the instructions. The workshop would be completed by early spring, a place for hands that remembered function, for minds that valued precision. He didn't know my name. I had made sure of that. I wanted no plaque, no photo, no legacy in stone, just a result. I folded the letter and placed it between the pages of my ledger. Later that day, Sarah arrived without warning. She rang the bell once, waited, then used the key. I heard her footsteps pause in the foyer, uncertain. She called my name, cautiously. I answered from the kitchen, where I was slicing apples for a pie I didn't plan to eat. She entered the room slowly, eyes scanning. Her expression told me everything. She wasn't sure anymore. Not about me, not about what she knew. That too was part of the shift. She asked questions. I answered with silence or misdirection. She tried to steer the conversation toward the box. I let her flounder in her assumptions. When she asked if I had forgotten something, I shook my head slowly, the way a man does when someone asks him where the sun goes at night. She left soon after, visibly unsettled. She hadn't come for conversation. She had come for reassurance, for confirmation that they still held the upper hand. But I had given her nothing. And that was everything. That night, I walked the length of the house in the dark, one hand trailing along the walls like a blind man reacquainting himself with familiar space. The corners were still sharp. The rugs still lay flat. The windows still closed tightly. My world, for all their efforts, had remained intact. This was the turning point. Not dramatic, not violent, not even visible to most. But I had felt it. In the pause before a question, in the flicker of doubt in their eyes, in the rising tone of their voices as they tried to mask desperation with confidence. They were no longer sure, and I no longer needed to pretend. I woke before the sun, as I always did. The sky outside the window was still the color of old slate, washed with the quiet indigo that came just before morning gave its permission. I sat up slowly, the way my body had learned to move after 70 years of wear. No pain that day, just weight. A familiar gravity in the joints, but it didn't matter. Something else filled the space where worry had once lived. It was quiet, not the kind of silence that felt like waiting, but the kind that settled in after something ended. Final, gentle, satisfying. I padded into the kitchen barefoot and filled the kettle without thinking. My hands moved from memory, not habit. There was a difference. Habit was mindless. Memory was choice. I chose everything now. As the water heated, I opened the back door and stepped outside. The air held that strange tension between night and day, where the world hasn't quite decided who it belongs to yet. I breathed in deeply. The grass was damp, the soil rich with decay and promise. Somewhere in the hedges, a bird began to sing. Tentative, like it wasn't sure anyone was listening. I was. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what would come next. There was no plan to revise, no angle to anticipate. The pressure had lifted. The performance was over. All the motions that had filled my days, the measured answers, the planted details, the strategic silences, were no longer necessary. I didn't need to protect anything anymore. I had already protected everything. When I returned inside, the kettle screamed, not an alarm, but as a signal. It was time. I made tea, strong, dark, simple. No sugar, no ceremony. I carried the mug to the living room and sat in my chair, the one that faced the window and the street beyond. It was still empty out there. No cars, no movement, no shadow of a figure pacing by the mailbox, waiting for some sign of change. They wouldn't come that day. They had nothing left to claim. The scent of the tea mixed with the cool morning breeze drifting through the screen. There was a note of bergamot from the tin I rarely opened, something my wife used to favor. It wasn't nostalgia I felt. It was permission. To breathe. To be. To inhabit space that belonged entirely to me. That was the smell of freedom. Not flowers or citrus or salt air. It was paper and tea and old wood warmed by the sun. It was the absence of performance, the absence of weight. I sat and listened to the world turn. Later the mail arrived. I heard the soft clink of the box closing. I took my time retrieving it. No urgency. Bills, flyers, one envelope from the utility company and a postcard from a neighbor who had moved to Arizona. Nothing from Sarah. Nothing from John. I returned to the table and opened each envelope carefully, slicing them with the small knife I kept in the drawer. I marked the due dates in a notebook, then filed them away. Everything was simple, predictable, honest. In the afternoon, I took a walk around the block. I didn't bring a phone. I didn't bring keys. Just a light jacket and $1 in my pocket in case I felt like buying a newspaper. The breeze had warmed, and the neighborhood smelled like cut grass and distant coffee. I nodded to a man watering his porch plants. He nodded back without recognition. That, too, was freedom. No one asked how I was doing. No one reminded me of who I was supposed to be. I passed the old church, the closed pharmacy, the gas station that never seemed to have more than 2 customers at a time. These were my landmarks, not because they were special, but because they had remained unchanged. Stability without control. A kind of background peace I hadn't noticed until everything else had gone quiet. When I returned home, I took the long way around the house, pausing in the backyard. The bird bath needed cleaning. I made a mental note. The garden beds were bare, but the soil was healthy. Spring would come again. Maybe I'd plant something this year. Not for show, not for yield, just because I could. Back inside, I cleaned out a drawer in the hallway. It had become a nest of forgotten items. Batteries, dead pens, expired coupons, bits of tape and string. I emptied it onto the floor, sorted what mattered, discarded what didn't. The trash bin filled quickly, and it felt good. Not symbolic, just clean. In the evening, I made soup, from scratch. Chopped onions, garlic, lentils. The broth simmered for an hour, and the scent filled the house with something warm and deep. I didn't rush it. I stirred slowly. I set the table just for one. No music, no television. Just me, the bowl, the steam rising like a benediction. When the sky went dark, I stood on the porch and looked out. The stars were faint, but they were there. A plane passed overhead, a soft roar carried by the wind. I remembered the sound of engines from long ago, and how I used to read their rhythms for signs of failure. Now I heard none. There was no failure here, just silence. The kind that didn't ask for anything, the kind that didn't hide. I went to bed early, not from exhaustion, but completion. The day had asked nothing of me but presence, and I had given it. Fully. Finally. I closed my eyes and breathed in the air of my own making. It smelled like freedom. I spent the next few days moving slowly through the house, not out of fatigue, but by design. Every drawer I opened, every object I touched, every step I took felt like part of a final inspection. It was the same methodical quiet I used to move through pre-flight checklists back in the hangars. Not looking for flaws so much as confirming integrity, making sure the system was still sound, that everything I had built would hold under pressure, even if I wasn't there to explain it. I started in the garage. That space had long stopped being a workshop and turned into something more like a vault of past versions of myself. Tools, shelves, storage bins, cans of screws labeled with fading Sharpie from years gone by. There was a box of electrical parts I hadn't touched in decades. Coils, fuses, connectors, some of them obsolete now. But I couldn't throw them away, not because of their value, but because of their function. They had once solved problems, and that mattered. I wiped the dust off the bench. The air smelled like oil and wood and cold metal, familiar, grounding. I sorted through my tools, placing them in the correct slots, cleaning off rust where I found it, not because I planned to use them, but because they deserved to rest in order. Behind the cabinet, I found a folded tarp and a wooden crate filled with old cables. I sorted them into piles. Keep, donate, discard. Every action felt like recalibration, a narrowing of purpose, removing what was no longer needed so that what remained could speak clearly. Inside the house, I moved from room to room with the same precision. The linen closet was first. I refolded towels, lined up pillowcases, checked for worn stitching. I boxed up the excess. There was no need to keep 10 sets when 2 were enough. I was simplifying not for the sake of minimalism, but for clarity. I wanted to be surrounded only by what made sense, by what belonged to me, not what had been brought in under the guise of care. In the study, I re-examined every folder, every document, every envelope. I verified the contents, destroyed what was no longer relevant. I sharpened pencils, replaced the ink in my pen, aligned notepads on the desk by the edge of the blotter. The small details mattered. They always had. I believed in straight lines, in measured margins, in everything having its place. The photograph of my wife still sat on the second shelf behind the ledger. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. Her eyes had watched me through all of this, through the shifts, the silences, the dismantling of expectations. I felt no pull toward melancholy, only gratitude. She would have understood. I took inventory of the pantry next. Canned goods, dried beans, tea, flour, rice. I marked the expiration dates, rotated the stock, wrote down what needed replacing. I went to the store the next day and bought only what was missing. I spoke to no one, paid in cash, came home before noon. In the hallway closet, I found the coat I used to wear when we traveled. Heavy wool, dark gray, good against the wind. I shook it out, checked the pockets. Inside one was a folded map of Vermont and a small receipt from a gas station we had stopped at 10 years ago. I held it for a moment, not because of what it represented, but because it reminded me of how long I had been paying attention. That even now, I could remember the direction of the wind on that day. I could remember the slope of the road. I folded the receipt and placed it back into the pocket. Then I hung the coat neatly and closed the door. In the basement, I checked the fuse box. Still tight. No signs of wear or corrosion. I ran the generator for 10 minutes just to be sure. The hum filled the silence like a familiar voice. I walked the perimeter of the foundation. Dry. No leaks. No cracks worth worrying over. Back upstairs, I cleaned the kitchen. Not a surface-level tidy, but a full disassembly. Pulling out the refrigerator, sweeping behind it, checking the seals, the coils. I cleaned the stove burners, realigned the shelves in the pantry, scrubbed the sink until the metal reflected light without distortion. I replaced the sponge, threw out the chipped mug Sarah had brought last winter. It never belonged. It didn't match the set. By the time I reached the bedroom, I felt lighter. Not because the work was done, but because every motion had been mine. Uninterrupted, uninfluenced. I changed the sheets, laundered the blanket, aired out the pillows. I opened the windows for an hour and let the wind move through. It smelled like clean fabric, wood smoke, and something older, deeper, like pine bark and memory. That evening, I sat at my desk and reviewed the ledger again, not to add anything, but to close the loop. I flipped through the pages slowly, scanning the records, the details, the notes I had made during the weeks of pressure. I added a final line at the bottom of the last page. System realigned, internal stability restored, awaiting nothing. I closed the book. Before bed, I walked through the house one last time. I turned off the lights room by room, not out of habit, but ritual. A final signal to myself that all systems had been checked, every wire tested, every joint tightened, no alarms, no static. When I lay down, the sheets were cool and perfectly tucked. I folded my hands over my stomach and stared at the ceiling for a while. It didn't speak back. It didn't need to. The machine was quiet. The lines were straight. The signals were clear, and I had nothing left to adjust. The morning began without tension. No sense of urgency. No unusual light at the edge of the curtain. I brewed my tea like I always did. 2 teaspoons of black leaves steeped for exactly 4 minutes, and stood at the window, watching the early fog dissolve over the tops of mailboxes and rooftops. The neighborhood had its rhythm, and that morning, it played as it always had. Except I knew something was different. Not around me, within them. I didn't need a clock to tell me where they were. By 9:12 a.m., they would have arrived at the bank. Sarah was never late for anything involving money. I imagined them stepping out of the car, Sarah smoothing her coat, John adjusting his collar with that clipped motion he did when he needed to feel in control. They would walk in side by side, poised, trying to appear composed, not eager. But they were eager. I could feel it from 100 miles away. The receptionist would greet them politely. She wouldn't know what this meant for them. Just another client requesting access. John would present the envelope. Sarah would lean in slightly, voice bright, falsely casual. "My father asked us to retrieve some papers," she would say. Not documents, papers. It always sounded softer that way. I could see the way the teller's hand would hover over the keyboard, entering my name, confirming the appointment in the system, verifying the signatures. Their IDs would pass inspection. The box number would be correct. The protocol would be followed step by step. They'd be led through the security door into the smaller waiting room, the one with the imitation leather chairs and the overhead fluorescent lights that hummed a little too loudly. That's where the anticipation would grow. They would be told to wait. In that moment, their nerves would betray them. Sarah would start organizing her purse, shuffling receipts that didn't need shuffling. John would lean forward, elbows on his knees, cracking his knuckles one by one. Their confidence would begin to flicker. They would mask it. But underneath, the questions would bloom. Had I left them something specific? A letter? Instructions? Was there a folder of final truths? A last testament? When the clerk returned with the box, they would straighten, eyes narrowing. Sarah would lean forward instinctively. The box would be set on the table with a soft thud, the key placed beside it like a challenge. They would unlock it together. And then it would open. And then the silence. I imagined the precise instant when their breath would catch, the beat of disbelief, the flicker of confusion transforming into panic, then into something more complex. Betrayal, shame, anger. The box would be empty. No folders, no envelopes, not even a slip of paper. Just air, cool and unremarkable, trapped inside a steel vault they had mistaken for destiny. The envelope I had left there long ago, the one that once held something, was gone. I had removed it weeks earlier. The contents redistributed. The meaning reassigned. There would be nothing in the box except the hollow echo of their expectations. That was the sound they would remember most. I knew exactly how long they would stare at it. 17 seconds, just long enough to exhaust every possibility. Had they made a mistake? Was there another box? Had I transferred the contents elsewhere? Was this a trick? No, just a void. John would close the lid first, fast, like he wanted to erase the moment. Sarah would hesitate. She would check again, as if something might suddenly appear. Then they would gather themselves, slowly, quietly, politely, and exit the room. They would thank the staff. They would walk to the car in silence. They wouldn't speak until the doors closed. And then it would come, the unraveling. Blame, confusion, denial, more silence. By the time they returned to my house, I had already cleaned the windows, washed the linens, written 3 lines in my ledger. I was wearing the same shirt I'd worn the day I handed over the key. It was intentional. Everything was intentional. I heard their car pull up. They didn't knock right away. I knew they were standing at the edge of the porch, unsure. For the first time in weeks, maybe in years, they were uncertain of how to proceed. The script was gone. The control had slipped. Eventually, Sarah knocked. I waited 5 full seconds before opening the door. Her eyes searched mine. John stood behind her, arms crossed, jaw set tight. Neither spoke. I said nothing. I stepped aside. They entered. The air inside the house was warm and clean. The smell of lemon oil and black tea lingered in the space between us. I walked to the kitchen, slow and deliberate, and began to prepare a second pot of tea. I didn't offer them any. I didn't ask them to sit. They followed me, waiting for a word, a signal, a confession. I gave them none. I watched their bodies shift, restless, waiting for me to explain myself, to admit something, to fill the silence with justification. But I had no intention of filling anything. That was the lesson. They had spent months circling me, convincing themselves that what I had was theirs, that the box was theirs, that the legacy belonged to them by default. But now they stood in the presence of something they couldn't manipulate. Absence. Pure. Clean. Absolute. They didn't stay long. John was the first to turn. Sarah lingered, her eyes softer now, less calculating. She wanted to ask. I could see it rising in her throat. But she didn't, because deep down, she already knew the answer. There was no prize. There never had been. There was only the mirror. And that day, it reflected exactly what they had brought with them. I noticed it first in the hallway mirror. Not my face, but the way I stood. Something about the posture was different. Not straighter, not prouder, just still, fully still. No forward lean, no habitual brace in the knees, no tilt of readiness like I'd grown used to carrying when they were around. The reflection wasn't younger, it wasn't stronger, it was just calm. That evening, the windows carried a faint layer of condensation from the soup I had simmered for dinner. I wiped one clean with my sleeve and looked out across the front yard, past the trees, past the street where the light from the neighbor's porch flickered as it always did. I stood there longer than I meant to, not watching, just being present with the transparency between me and the world. Something in that pane of glass reminded me of everything I had been through to arrive at this precise moment. Not a victory, not a loss, but a stillness carved out by the act of choosing to no longer be a subject of someone else's narrative. My hands were still. My breath moved evenly. I was not waiting for anything anymore. I walked through the house after that, and paused by each window, each mirror, each surface that could show me a piece of myself. I didn't do it to admire or reflect in the traditional sense. I did it to verify something real, that I still existed independent of their stories, their assumptions, their plans, that I had not been erased by the weight of their expectations. In the mirror above the sink, I saw my father's jaw. In the darkened glass of the oven door, I saw the slope of my shoulders, once squared by military instinct, now softened by time. In the reflection of the picture frame in the hallway, I saw the outline of my figure beside my wife's portrait, not touching, just near. That frame had sat untouched for years, and yet only now did I fully recognize the stillness in her face was the same kind I had finally earned. Not peace as in ease, but peace as in clarity. I had done what she would have understood, not fought, not shouted, not retaliated. I had outwaited, outmeasured, outlasted. The light faded slowly that evening, and the reflections grew fainter, but I stayed near the windows. It wasn't loneliness. It wasn't nostalgia. It was confirmation. I had spent so long being seen through the lens of others, as a provider, as an asset, as a slowly decaying body to be managed, that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to see myself directly, without commentary. I had cleaned the glass a few days before. A full scrub, vinegar, newspaper, circular motions until the panes gleamed. At the time, I thought it was just part of the final calibration, part of the process of order. But now I saw what it really was. Preparation for a moment like this. A moment where nothing stood between me and my own reflection. There were no fingerprints anymore, no smudges from curious grandchildren, no grease from Sarah's hands, no faint marks from John's knuckles when he leaned in to speak softer than necessary. Just clean, flat light, and me in it. Earlier that day, I had walked past the bank, not to go inside. I had no business there anymore, but to witness the place from a distance. I stood across the street for nearly 20 minutes, blending into the foot traffic, watching the way people came and went. None of them looked like Sarah or John. None of them moved with the sharp, clamped rhythm of those who had been blindsided by absence. I could imagine the conversations they were now having, the recalculations, the damage control, not just with each other, but inside themselves, wondering how they missed it, how they didn't see what I had done, how they'd been fooled by a man they assumed was fading. But I hadn't faded. I had crystallized. That was the thing about glass. It's both fragile and cutting. It breaks easily, yes, but it can also reflect a truth so clear it becomes sharp. That's what I had become for them. Not a broken man, but a mirror. And they hadn't liked what they saw. When the night finally deepened and the reflections in the windows faded into black, I turned off the lights one by one. The house adjusted to the darkness without resistance. I walked into the bedroom, washed my face, and looked once more at the man in the mirror. The bags under the eyes, the faint lines along the mouth, the thinning hair, they were all still there. But they no longer read as signs of decline. They were the record of endurance. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I simply turned away, knowing I had seen myself clearly. Not as a father, not as a burden, not as a sum of assets and liabilities, but as a man who had taken his story back in silence. And that, in the end, was enough. The morning began with rain. Not a storm, not a heavy downpour, just a steady, rhythmic tapping against the windows, the kind that quiets everything and softens the edges of the world. I didn't reach for an umbrella or check the weather report. I just stood in the center of the kitchen and listened. The rain didn't ask questions. It didn't demand explanations. It simply arrived, unapologetic, and did what it was meant to do. I understood that. I brewed my tea, slower than usual. Not from hesitation, but because there was nowhere to be. No arrival to anticipate, no knock on the door, no voice calling through the house, pretending to be warm while measuring the temperature of my compliance. That chapter was over. I sat by the window, the cup warm in my hands, and watched the droplets trace paths down the glass like they had somewhere important to be. I felt the finality in my bones, not as an ending, but as a settling. The way a building exhales once the scaffolding is removed. The structure holds. You trust it. You move on. I had no list for the day. No tasks I had left undone. The house was in order. The papers filed. The accounts closed or redirected. The final letters written in my head, if not on paper. I didn't need to explain the why of it all. Silence had served me better than any confession could. They hadn't returned since the day of the box. No more phone calls. No more drive-by visits. No more questions disguised as care. They had receded like a tide that took more than it left behind. But I was not a shoreline eroded by their absence. I was a man rebuilt by it. I opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch. The rain soaked into the wood, darkening it beneath my feet. The air smelled of earth and moss like a season turning. I walked out into the yard, let the water land on my skin, on my shoulders, on the back of my neck. I didn't flinch. I didn't shield myself. There was something pure in being rinsed clean by the world. I stood by the garden bed where the tomatoes used to grow. The soil had gone wild without tending, but even the weeds had a kind of beauty to them. Resilient, disobedient. I liked that. I imagined planting again, not for harvest, but just to watch something rise from the ground for no one's benefit but its own. Later, I went inside and dried off. I changed clothes, folded the damp ones neatly, placed them near the heater to dry. I made a sandwich, ate it without urgency. Each bite was a small ceremony, not because it marked anything important, but because it didn't. That was the point. Normalcy, untethered from anyone else's expectations. In the afternoon, I sat at my desk and opened the ledger one last time. Not to write anything new, just to look at the pages. The records of weeks and days when I moved quietly, deliberately, under the weight of other people's stories. I ran my hand over the final page. The ink had dried clean. No smears, no corrections. I closed the book and placed it in the drawer. Then I locked the drawer and threw the key into the drawer beneath it. I would remember where it was if I ever needed it. I doubted I would. I didn't think about Sarah or John much anymore. They had faded into abstraction, not out of malice, not out of spite, just distance, emotional and otherwise. I wished them no harm. I hoped they would learn. I doubted they would. As the sky darkened, I lit a candle. Not for symbolism, just because I liked the flicker, the way it painted movement across the walls. I watched the flame dance and cast long shadows of the things that surrounded it. The chair, the cup, the spine of a book resting open beside me. It all felt right. No need for rearrangement. No need for further design. Before bed, I walked through the house one last time. Not as ritual, not as habit, just a final walk. The floor creaked beneath my feet the way it always had. The hallway stretched out in its usual narrowness. The bedroom door welcomed me in silence. I turned off the lights, pulled the covers back, and lay down. The sheets were cool. The air still. No voices, no sounds of others breathing. Just me. And in that moment, not a second before, not a second after, I felt the click of something deep inside me. Not a lock, not a door, a calibration, a final adjustment. Everything was aligned. I closed my eyes and let the darkness take its natural shape. No thoughts, no rehearsals, no weight. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that nothing had been taken from me, because I had already given everything I meant to give, and held back only what was truly mine.